When you play in a theatrical setting and it's a bunch of stuff playing in order, do you ever watch it? Do you ever like see what it's like to see a series of your own work versus just individual pieces, I guess?
It's something I'm still not used to yet, actually, to sit through like a whole sequence or series of my works.
Yeah.
I feel like it can be quite overwhelming for me, but I also feel like it's the right pace because I'm a really distracted kind of viewer, so I enjoy works that move quickly. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious from a spectatorial standpoint about seeing a bunch of things in unison versus like seeing them as they come out individually. Like, do you think that it's going to draw connections that maybe you wouldn't have noticed when you're making them with a gap between them, or when people are consuming them in that way?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are tropes or like relationships between the different videos that come through. For example, shirt ripping.
Yeah.
It's this, I guess, performative gesture that's done by some people on YouTube as a way of like looking at their bodybuilding results, and there's other queer audiences on YouTube who kind of like enjoy watching that, and then there's like a kind of YouTube fetish community or like online fetish communities around just like muscle worship. And so these are connections I started making in these different works where like I featured like shirt ripping by both, bodybuilder users as well as like muscle fetish, like queer community users. And I like used those kind of user generated YouTube video footage in different works. But then I like began like seeing that there was, connections in terms of like the way I wanted to explore how like different users were negotiating masculinity, and I'm adding like my own kind of commentary and kind of celebration, but also a revolt critique towards that. So those kinds of like connections between aesthetic tropes definitely come through a little bit more when I see the work in a series. Yeah.
You contributed other films to this kind of, you've curated other works, you call them non-art, that are in it, but did you have a say in your own work, like the order it was being presented in, or was that a decision Images made?
I think there was like a, I guess, back and forth kind of exchange about, what was going to go where, but I have the final say in terms of the lineup, so I think they had more so like the decision around like the curatorial framing of the work, like so how my work was introduced and the titling of the program.
And what do you consider when you're coming up with a playlist like that? Like what is like the one that you're immediately like, this is going to open it, this is going to close it?
I tend to think of like the way of lining up a program in terms of like pacing and also perhaps like the shock value relative to like, I guess, the public audience in terms of what goes where. Yeah, so in some of these works, there's like sexually explicit content, like in Young Money, there's a point of view shot footage of a guy masturbating onto a pizza patterned shirt. And I decided to kind of place that later on in the program so people would understand the way I worked with video more. Yeah.
One thing I noticed is that maybe when you're seeing them presented like one by itself, the frame is just the frame, but when you're seeing them all one after another, you start to notice how frames shift. It's something that I find curious with internet works or things that deal with the internet, because we're maybe more accustomed to frames changing, whereas in the theater, you kind of, it's more shocking if something goes from being like a wide to like a tall, like...
You mean like portrait orientation video? I suppose I don't think of, online video in this way. I think I more so think of GIFs in terms of this frame-by-frame way where like the jerkiness and the transitions and the discrete movements of pixels in a GIF and the dithering kind of changes frame by frame. That's how I think of GIFs, but I don't think of video, in terms of frame-by-frame movement.
Like that's funny though that we're confused over this, because it's like now frames does mean that. It's like with GIFs and things like that, but I was thinking frames like the physical frame of the screen.
Oh, right.
Like framing, like with painting or whatever, like when you take like a cell phone thing like this versus like this, you know how people hate online videos that are shot like this as opposed to shot like this because they're used to like a wide frame, and you have a piece that is a I guess portraiture, right? And seeing it with things that are wide, you start to looking for that, or when you have frames within a frame. It's something that came out, and I noticed watching these in the order you have. And I was curious when you shifted to doing the portrait one, it also seems like there's a lot of stuff happening outside of what you can see. Like that's the tension, like what's happening outside of the frame. In that one particular, was that something that you had noticed in, I guess, would it be pornography, I guess, that people are shooting? This was
the one you're talking about is called Glow.
Glow.
It was a piece I made for a selfie themed show for Moving Image Linden, and actually is inspired by a piece called Untitled Camera Blow by Jessica Joy. That work can be found at VTape. And it was a piece that I found very, I guess, seductive to watch. She's kind of, performing a blowjob towards a static camera. It's very sensual. For me, I began thinking about the kind of, physical labor or like the awkwardness sometimes, or the confrontational aspect of giving a blowjob, and I wanted to do that for an iPhone. And so with selfies, I think there's always this kind of vernacular towards it, the portrait kind of orientation, or like the very like self-conscious, reflexive, candid kind of nature of having your arm extended or like having it held in a particular way that's very flattering. And so, I wanted to create a more like confrontational remake of this camera blowjob, but with the penis absent, obviously. But there's a lot of, I guess, hints or nods towards amateur pornography.
And even when you say with the selfie, like the ones that where you can still see the arm, and the ones that are better at hiding the arm from being in the frame, like I find that there's something about that style of framing that is kind of, it always seems to hide something. And it's kind of what you're saying about finding the precise angle, and you're kind of hiding the production of that angle, like how it's happening. Yeah,
I think that shifted a lot from like, say, 2004 MySpace time, when there was, this kind of, I guess, falsified, candid, way of addressing the camera, where people would be looking away, yet, taking the shot of themselves, and you could see the arm inside the picture. Maybe it's something I relate to as well, because I was an emo kid on MySpace back in the day. So that was vernacular towards that time, but now people are just very like self-reflexive about taking selfies. Like, yes, so what? I'm cropping out the rest of whatever's beyond the frame and just focusing on myself, and it's my way of connecting to the world, or trying to make the world care about things that I care about, or just me being there. So I think it's, more than like a narcissistic or vain invocation. I think it is also like kind of like a handshake to the world, or a way to like frustrate the viewer if they want to say something about the way women are represented in porn predominantly. So that was my intention anyway.
And with Young Money, I think it's Young Money with the Skype kind of, how you can like see yourself? Like, what if I was talking with you on Skype, I would see you, but I would also see a little bit of what you're seeing of me, like, so I can keep track of that. Like, I like that there's kind of like a spatial disorientation that happens with that, like, because you're seeing something in one frame that looks like it may also be in the other frame. It's the pizza shirt, more or less, that is like kind of going back and forth, and it kind of collapses the space because they're all within the same visual space. And I'm curious what your thoughts are when you're representing a maybe more narrative, like that one seems to have more of a narrative drive, how space is represented.
For that piece, I was really thinking about there being, like always a sense of mediated idea of sexuality and how it should play out, and then there's the embodied, idea of sexuality or sexual feelings. And that was how, the frame within a frame, or the video image inside another larger video image, was the way I tried to reconcile or display this disjunction between like embodied point of view perspectives, on your own sexuality. In particular, it was the male masturbation scene versus, the long shot of the masturbating subject. There's always this mediated or externalized idea or relationship to looking at porn like in a very voyeuristic way. So that was why it was important for me to have these two perspectives in there. So there's like a sympathetic perspective, and also this kind of like maybe anxious or externalized one.
It almost seems like it's transcended too, or it's about to be transcended, but it really isn't, just with the movement. Like when someone stands up and all of a sudden it goes from being like a perfect shot of their face that you can see to just like like you can't really tell the like what part of the body, like the movement in front it seems almost like they're going to go through the the frame into the other frame in this case, which I found really interesting. But I'm curious about the word aggression that's like kind of associated, like the aggressiveness of images or the aggressiveness of what is it called? Image data. Barrage of image data. That was one of the terms they used to describe it. Is that something that you see, that the circulation of images has an aggression to it?
That's a really good observation, because a lot of people have responded to my work in that way. And
yeah.
I think for me, like, it's a way of dialoguing with images, because, you know, with the popularization of different media sharing platforms like Tumblr and Instagram, and even, you know, the continuous posting of photos on Facebook, or like posting of art documentation on websites like vivework.com. There's just, you know, a decline of discussion around images, and, you know, it's usually just one caption. So for me, it's a way of just, you know, dialoguing with images, and it can appear aggressive, but I think it's, you know, partly my style, and also a way I illustrate my mental landscape, you know, as kind of anxious or very rapid. Yeah.
But when you mentioned rapid earlier, you seem very comfortable with it. Like, it's not like threatening. Like, there's like maybe something reassuring about things moving really quickly. Whereas it seems like some people, they find that that's like aggressive, or it's threatening when the images are moving, like cycling through in a speed that they're not used to. Is that like a generational thing, or is it just an exposure to different types of media?
I think maybe it's the way I've adapted to the flow of images and like different, you know, feeds of information online. Yeah. And I think it's definitely also become stylized, you know, as a video making kind of technique. Yeah. But yeah, it's a way of working that I'm very comfortable with. I've definitely tried to make slower works. There are pieces, I think, that are slower, like Important Objects, which was also made for a selfie-themed show, except I decided to focus on various objects in a seductive way and compare these objects to me as like a performing subject. And so I think that's a slower video in the mix, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the seductive quality? That's something that other people see in these, or maybe a sensuality of objects. And you mentioned fetish as well. That seems like something that kind of comes up with how these objects are presented. What is your line of thinking when you're engaging with the topic of sensuality or seductiveness?
Well, I think there's like a lot of new media art that is very clean and slick. I suppose like inspired by design, like user-friendly web design, or like Apple computers and the minimalist aesthetic that's become very popular on the internet. But I also think that like you know, this other way of thinking about the internet is that it's like a long tail of desire, and long tail being like a keyword address. Long tail being like this term that addresses like the infinite, you know, amount of search results that can show up when you type something in on a search engine. I think that, you know, the internet is the space that accommodates a whole variety of sexualities and visual interests. And so early on, when I was just on YouTube, like 2005, when it had just first came out, everything was on there, like from bestiality to like people, you know, just doing confessional vlogs. And at that time, there weren't partnerships yet, so people were really just making videos for the enjoyment of making videos and connecting with other people with similar interests. And so, yeah, I began like watching these different types of videos that were non-sexual fetishes. I think some people were really performing various gestures, like using their shoes to crush objects, wearing high heels or wearing sandals, and kind of walking around in them repeatedly. And there's this connection to performance art, but at the same time it was like an enjoyment in doing those things. And much like I was talking about like shirt ripping earlier on, you know, there were also like teen boys that were making these videos teaching other teen boys how to rip their shirts. And then of course there would be some kind of queer audience tapping into that. And so yeah, I kind of like became influenced by, you know, this kind of focus on the action of performing something, or focus on an object in an empathetic way that's fetishistic. And, you know, I think for some people there's a fascination with it, like it's a freak show, and then like, you know, there can be an empathetic way of thinking about it as like a sexual interest, or even like a visual interest. So I think a lot of the way I deal with images online and also like the discussions of like masculinity or femininity around it is like both like celebratory and also sometimes, you know, coming from a place of revolt. So various aspects of bro culture, like bodybuilding, I find like hyper masculinity and just muscularity actually quite revolting. But then, like, come to think about it, there's this kind of dedication and this pressure to become masculine that comes through in all these videos. And so, yeah, that's why I enjoy collecting these videos and also, like, ripping them and transforming them, combining them with other kind of conflicting imagery to create a kind of commentary about it.
That tension between kind of empathy and revolt, it seems interesting with the Mac computer specifically, because not only is it a design that everyone's become accustomed to liking, the sleekness, but to see it kind of been destroyed, you have to kind of empathize with people that enjoy this, but also, and it's the same with the dollar bills, and like taking something that we associate with appreciation and then having to accept someone's interest in destroying it. It puts you in an interesting place as a spectator. And also, you as someone, as the artist making it, whether what you're condoning or not condoning, it becomes interesting because you have to just accept that you don't know, like whether this is sincere or if it's an appreciation of something, if it's a challenging of another opinion, and it's something that comes up with sincerity and joking in yours, or like irony, because there's one where it says this is not a joke and joke's not even spelled right, and like you always feel like you've adopted a space where you're jumping back and forth. Is that meant to be kind of a provocative thing, or is it just to try to get the parameters of the viewer knowing what you necessarily mean, just removing it from the equation?
I think that I'm coming from a sincere place, but with like, I guess, contemporary viewership now, I'm gonna quote John Rathman on this idea, where he says like we've kind of reached a place where we don't know whether someone's celebrating or critiquing something when they make a post or they like a status update that's, you know, generally disastrous. And so I think that irony could come from a sincere place if it, you know, is goal oriented at, for example, like critiquing a very big visual cliche. And I think that like when people maybe don't know me as a person, for example, with important objects, I actually really did make it when I was completely heartbroken. I wanted to make something seductive and beautiful and about myself, but maybe not in a conventional way where people just shoot their own face as a selfie. And so I think that like, yeah, it is informed by like universal cliches so that like people can access them easily, but at the same time, I think I intensify them to such a degree that people also seem to read it ironically, and I'm okay with that. Like, in terms of people thinking that perhaps I'm joking and it's ironic. I think I've become also very aware of like, I guess that kind of viewership online, the kind of, oh haha, everything's good, it's, you know, very post-critical, and because there is such like a flattening of all kinds of signifiers with imagery online, because there's just so much of it in a stream on Tumblr, for example, I kind of deal with that by kind of fighting back or talking back with images. Yeah, I tend to think that there's actually like too much meaning versus no meaning at all. Or
meaning, or accepting that meaning can be contradictory, or like it can operate like irony. And one meaning of the word that we don't really use that much is just like the multiple meanings that occur. So maybe some of them are contradictory, but that doesn't mean it's less sincere.
Definitely, yeah. In my use of like rolling text, there being, you know, maybe two lines of text going in the opposite direction, is a way of like displaying that there's like always kind of, you know, contradictory feelings. And I notice that I do that a lot, and people ask about it, and it is because I'm embarrassed to some extent about both feelings or both lines of thoughts, or like, you know, the use of both types of imagery that are cliche and also sincere from another perspective. And so, hence the contradiction.
And another contradiction would be with the text, I believe, in one of them, like knowing versus not knowing. Like you saying, like, I don't actually know what I'm doing. Like it can be something like an admission of like guilt, like of not really having a firm idea, but it's also very controlling and and very confident to say that, right? So it is like, as you say, like for someone that potentially, if you trust it, doesn't know what they're doing, there's a lot of meaning that's being generated nonetheless. So is it, you start to question, is it important that whether someone knows or does not know what they're eventually putting out there?
Maybe it's both a way of addressing that I don't know what I'm doing, like how do I make a piece of work that addresses the financial recession in Greece, because that's a line that comes from the video Infinite Debt, where I'm frying a Euro-dollar bill. And for me, actually, it was like a common sensibility to use a wok and like, deep fry it in this battered dough. But like from other viewers later, they were telling me about their response to the video, and it was like, obviously a very Chinese thing to do was to fry it in this circular curved wok. And so there are certain like signifiers that I'm not aware would invoke, particular readings. But in terms of the text, being very like self-reflexive or confessional, I think it's just important for me to like put it there. I guess like for me, that's a sincerity part.
Yeah, and speaking of the wok, the recurring pizza motif, I for some reason was connecting it with you mentioning that people want palatable images, or that's what they're drawn to. And it seems like pizza, to some extent, represents like the most palatable, like widely palatable of all foods. Like it's just something that people easily consume. What is some of the thinking that goes behind that imagery, be it in the shirt or in like with all of the Parmesan, kind of turning it into something else entirely?
With pizza, I think it's this kind of palatable global food.
Yeah.
Everyone has general feel-good feelings around it. It is very like, available. It's something that you can just eat in one hand and like be, surfing the internet in another, or studying. And so, I think of that as kind of like a universal, but it's also kind of like a recurring motif in internet art and just in memes online. And so, I wanted to take that as, this general globalized food icon, and also combine that with my critique of like particular, I guess, college-aged males hanging out online and the ways perhaps they relate to mainstream internet porn. And so I was also inspired or informed by one of these reality TV / gonzo style porn series called Big Sausage Pizza. And I think this came out maybe around like 2006. It was something I saw when I was like 16, but it really like stuck to me as one of those like porn / food fetish things. Kind of exemplified the ridiculousness of the internet, but also a particular style of like pornography that I think has become quite popular, is this like reality / amateur inspired style. I mean, it's not amateur in the way that it's made by users and uploaded online, but it's a group of people who produce porn that, like the reality gang, that decided they're going to use fly on the wall shots and like handheld cams and kind of ridiculous or sometimes even humiliating content in their work. And so when I first saw that porn series, Big Sausage Pizza, I was just incredulous because of the way it was shot. The narrative content or the quality is low. It's very low sensuality. It's really a pizza man arriving at the door of a young, college-age blonde girl, and opens the door with a pizza. Cut to the next shot, he's sitting there with pizza box on his lap, opens the pizza box, and his penis is protruding through the center of the pizza. And all the sexual activity happens around this pizza. And again, I was both fascinated and revolted, and that kind of conflicting feeling of like fascination, partial arousal, and revolt kind of stuck with me, and I think continued to inform my work around critiquing masculinity and femininity online. And so I think that's how pizza kind of like carried through onto that work. But then I guess it it's not an explicit kind of connection with porn, so to speak. Now, in terms of the pizza shirt, it's actually an art project by Sterling Crispin. It's sold on pizzashirt.net. And so I guess there's a kind of latent critique or talk back to the way like internet aesthetics have become commodified. And I know I participate in that in some way because, like, my work, as well as existing online functions in the art realm. But yeah, I thought that the pizza pattern shirt, was a way of, like, kind of frustrating that fetish of, like, showing a cum shot happening on a body, like, to instead show it on an object. And I'm sure on the internet, there's probably going to be an audience that's going to be, like, fascinated with, like, coming on objects because there's a come on food website and things like that. But I was really thinking about, like, mainstream tropes in internet porn, and the moment of, like, the cum shot happening on a body is, like, it marks the end of a scene, but it's also this kind of power dynamic. I think it's like, to come on the body of a male or a female is to kind of, like, take ownership of a particular moment of climax on someone's body. And so what happens in that scene in Young Money is after the masturbating subject comes onto the pizza pattern shirt, I remove it from him and I wear it myself. And there's a exchange, from the camera perspective going on him and to himself to me. And so it's a way of me addressing, like, I'm the director in some ways as well, or, like, I have a part in creating that moment. Yeah.
But then it's also commodified in the sense that the pizza image then is the sellable thing for cool videos, right? Like, isn't that, like, it's kind of twisting in and out, and then with the time code, and it can literally be sold at that point.
Yeah, and it was referencing stock imagery,
but
and how that can be sold. Yeah.
But I'm wondering, with this evolution, as you mentioned, like, going through the mainstream, like, what happens when something like that is, like, Beyonce's wearing it, you're seeing, like, BuzzFeed articles that are like 10 pizza-based clothings that you can get. Like, does that lose its potency as an image for the circles you're talking about, or does that add, like, a new appeal to it?
I think it just extends the dialogue and, like, the trafficking, of particular niche aesthetics into popular culture back and forth. I think that culture flows, and I think with internet aesthetics, we saw that with C-punk, how Rihanna kind of appropriated or, like, used, I guess, what people consider, like, Tumblr-based lo-fi 3D graphics in her background during her SNL performance of Diamonds. And I don't think of it as, like, a loss as much as, like, a kind of possibility for the infinite reproduction or spread or particular enjoyment of certain aesthetics. So yeah, I'm not against that at all. I think that it's very interesting how, like, certain artists or even musicians co-opt particular aesthetics. And for me as a remix artist, I find that particularly liberating.
Yeah. I'm curious what your thoughts then are of how these things, as you say, like, they get co-opted pretty easily in the flow of culture to music or to other forms of visual art, but it seems like film is the most resistant to these new forms of aesthetic that we've kind of seen come out of the internet. Like, they don't seem to broach through into film, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why that may be.
I'm unsure, and I come from a particular position that's quite anti-film in the formal celluloid purist aesthetic sense, and also the, like, traditional beginning, middle, end narrative sense.
Yeah.
So I think that maybe, like, film has a tradition of valuing, like, authorship, or, like, there being a director who plans things carefully and shoots his own images, and so maybe they're resistant to that because there, is a tradition that values the narrative or, like, the production of original imagery. But I think that, with there being almost a simultaneity of, like, creation, or, like, with there being, like, a simultaneity of, like, consciousness about particular things that are happening at the same time now, I think that it's very, hard to, be sure that you're making something that's, original in terms of, like, how you're shooting, because we're informed by everything we've already watched. So yeah, I think that film perhaps values, like, originality in the sense of, handcraft, shooting your own material, and then also, like, planning meticulously. And it's a way that I don't work, but I can, think of that as, like, possible answer to that question.
Yeah, or maybe that it doesn't show how much like film tends to protect, like, this is very expensive to do, and everything we do is expensive, and if you were to broach into that other world, it would just, like, knock the house of cards down, because you could use stock footage, you could use stock footage you haven't even paid for that still has, like, the logo on it or whatever, and there's, like, maybe a freedom there that it behooves them to not allow into the realm.
Yeah, definitely. It's what Kirby Ferguson, the guy who made Everything as a Remix, calls aversion to loss.
Yeah.
There's got a fear of, like, you know, losing the production cost value, or, like, losing some sense of the original claim to producing an idea, or having, you know, intellectual property and ownership over a particular idea, way of working with something. But I think even again and again in film, we see people referencing particular tropes, like, you know, particular ways that Hitchcock uses his camera, or like the way Tarantino writes his scripts. So I don't think that we're, you know, free of that, you know, claim of, you know, originality or loss. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the question.